Illuvatar is a monotheistic god in Middle-earth who impacts the story, but isn't based off of just any god. He is based off of the God of the Bible, as can be seen in Tolkien's faith as a devout Catholic, and his proclamation that LOTR is a Christian work. Join David Green and I as we discuss how coincidence is actually Illuvatar's hand in Middle-earth. And don't forget to like and subscribe. This is the second of a 4-part series that I'm doing on what I've called the 4 pillars of Tolkien's worldview in Middle-earth. So those are temptation, divine intervention, universal morality, and good versus evil. So I've already done temptation. This episode is on divine intervention, and I will do universal morality and good versus evil at a later point down the road. So, hope you guys enjoy this. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today I have a new guest with me, David Green, and it's good to have you on, David.
Thanks very much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this all December and January.
Yeah, I know it's been a bit for us to actually finally connect, but yeah, I think this would be great. So before we get into more of like divine intervention and Illuvatar and his hand in the story, what got you into Lord of the Rings, David?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I think everyone always remembers when they got into Tolkien and all of his work, and for me, it was The Hobbit. Back when I was very young, so nearly 40 years ago now, because I'm just turned 43, and I read The Hobbit for the first time when I was 7. I still have the same copy of it, and I know I was 7 because I wrote my name, my address, and my age in it because I had an older brother and I had to claim it as mine. Um, which wasn't I shouldn't have been worried because he doesn't read. I don't know like why I was so worried about it, but there was just something about the book that um, was precious to me, I guess, and made me want to claim it. So I read that, and ever since then, I wanted to become a writer myself. So it really kind of inspired that in me. But The Hobbit was all I kind of read for a while, and then it's when I started secondary school, as we call it in the UK. We had a library, and I was a big reader. I'd read quite a lot of Arthurian legends and stuff. And where I grew up in the UK, it was quite a great place for a lot of like myth and legends to be inspired by, and folklore and what have you. And I was in the library one day, and I was kind of looking, and I saw this name J.R.R. Tolkien. And I was like, "Oh, that's the guy who wrote The Hobbit." I didn't realize that he had these other books here, and it was the Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, Return of the King. So I borrowed them, tore through them. It was like nothing else that I'd ever read. Particularly like I was familiar with some of it from the start, from The Hobbit, but then obviously once Aragorn comes into the story, it kind of becomes a sequel to the Silmarillion, doesn't it? Really, which I hadn't read at that point, and then from then on, I was completely hooked. Read everything multiple times. History of Middle Earth as soon as they were being released, because this was in the 90s. And yeah, avidly kept up to date with when the movies were announced and the casting was going on, and counting down the days for when they were going to be released, and go into internet cafes to go onto websites to see grainy photos people are taking in New Zealand and all that. So yeah, it's been a big part of my life for a long time, and it's always great. Now I am a writer myself, an author. It's always nice when people see the Tolkien influence in my work as well, which is obviously always going to be there.
Mm-hmm. No, that's cool. Yeah. So I guess the animated Hobbit then would have been like your kind of the first film for you to get into.
No, actually, it was the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings one. I saw
Yeah,
that one
yeah.
first. Yeah, I
Oh,
saw
okay,
that
I
one.
see.
Yeah, I saw that one first before. and before the Rankin and Bass Hobbit or Rankin and Bass Return of the King. I found those ones later. The Ralph Bakshi one used to be on TV quite a bit in the UK, and I remember one time they had a double bill of Ralph Baksh's Lord of the Rings and then Excalibur, which was amazing for a teenage me. It was like, I've got a real soft spot for Ralph Baksh's Lord of the Rings, and I know Peter Jackson does as well. And you can see quite a lot of homages in the movies, a lot of scenes like one-for-one recreations as well, which I find is interesting. Um, and yeah, I have a real love for that film, even though I acknowledge its shortcomings at the same time. It means a lot to me, that one.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So as we get into divine intervention, um, I thought like one thing that I think is always interesting when talking about this, it's like people online, especially, is like how much do like they consider like Illuvatar's impact in the Lord of the Ring in like the Middle Earth story, right?
Mhm.
I know like doing my podcast, I've had more kind of faith focused guests, and it's interesting how many people are mentioning like Illuvatar's impact or how he's done his like plan for things, and yeah, so like I guess in like a sense, like what's, I guess maybe just like this, like talk a little bit more about like Illuvatar. I guess tell like maybe how would you just give kind of a description of him and how he kind of the different things that he's done in Middle Earth.
Yeah, he's an interesting figure. I'm not a particularly religious person. I was brought up as a Catholic, as a Roman Catholic, being from the part of the world that I am from. And I was heavily involved in Catholic Church when I was younger because I went to Catholic school. We had to go to church very often. I used to serve on the altar as a child and so on. So you kind of so it was easy for me when I started to pick up Lord of the Rings to really see the influence of Tolkien's religion before I even knew he was particularly religious. And that was in a different way to Chronicles of Narnia, for example, which was explicit in terms of where its influence and where its religion it comes from. Where and all that, I think Tolkien is more subtle with it, but I think it's more woven into the tapestry of Tolkien's world building and Tolkien's approach to storytelling and achievement than Narnia's is. I think Narnia's is very much kind of on the nose, whereas Tolkien's approach to it's completely intrinsic to everything that he looks through. The lens of how he looks through as a creative is all from this one point of there can only be one creator, and and only good can create. And the other very important thing that he, I think, he seems to go back to quite a lot. Well, there's two things. What the other one is everything was good at conception. And the other thing then is that you have to these moments of divine intervention they have to be earned, um, which is interesting because it kind of bumps up against the idea of Ilúvatar's plan, right? Which he when you read the Silmarillion and you read the song of the the song of creation and everything like that, and Ilúvatar says to Morgoth, "You think you can disrupt this, but there's nothing in you that is not in me, and there's this whole plan." But there is this kind of feeling that his divine intervention, which like the eucatastrophe of the moments in the Lord of the Rings in particular, have to be earned. They're not just going to happen. They have to kind of keep going, and they're rewarded by these moments. which I find is quite interesting because would Illuvatar withhold these moments if people didn't earn them? So there's a very interesting relationship between destiny and free will in Tolkien's work, which is also something that is very, very central to Christian faith as well, in terms of there is a divine plan from God, but he also gave everyone free will. Um, and that is really, really consistent within Tolkien's work as well. And that is really highlighted with Frodo, Bilbo, and Gollum, in terms of like pity and mercy and being rewarded with that eucatastrophic moment where Gollum gets the ring but falls and the ring is destroyed. So Illuvatar is an interesting character. It's an interesting concept, and there is that thing of with a lot of people who are religious and who aren't religious, or people that are religious and doubt their faith sometimes, where they'll ask their God or the one God, whichever God you believe in, why do you allow such suffering? Why do you, if this is part of the plan, why is the plan this way? And I think Tolkien's work deals with that as well. It doesn't really kind of shy away from that, but it kind of does always come down to the point that it's all part of a greater good and a greater plan, which, with his religious beliefs, he would fall down on that side of it, I think, and I think that was very, very important for him.
Okay. Yeah. So I hadn't really thought about how the characters were, I guess, in a sense, working to like receive the like divine intervention you're saying. So like
Yeah.
so I think like the most clear one, at least in Lord of the Rings, is when you have Gandalf talking to Frodo and telling him that, like Bilbo was meant to find the ring and you were meant to have it. And then, he kind of goes into like there's a greater being in the story than we like realize, I guess. So like I guess how in that instance is like is there like an award there, I guess?
Yeah, I think there's instances of, particularly if you look at kind of Sauron, for example, who is an angelic being that is born of good, and is corrupted, and then has those moments where he could repent. And there's Tolkien kind of goes back and forth, and if you go into the notes and all that kind of stuff about whether he actually did repent and go backwards or what. But there was that. It was there was debate there, and it kind of comes down to with Sauron ego of not being able to go to someone and say and beg for forgiveness and beg for confession, basically, isn't it? He can't confess his crimes and seek repentance. Right, that's what it ultimately comes down to. But is that something that was always the plan with Sauron? So this is the thing that you have to think about when it comes to the Christian concepts of free will within a larger plan. Was Sauron always destined to turn that down and to flee and to hide and to fall even into greater evil? Or is there a version of it where Sauron could have confessed and begged for forgiveness and received forgiveness? And how would that have looked like in that larger plan? Would something else have risen to take that Sauron's place? Because obviously the grand plan of Ilúvatar is that the world must be unmade before it can be remade whole again, and be Arda unmarred again once more, as it was when it was first created. So is that really the largest plan of it, where Illuvatar is quite content with at some point it will get there, right? And every point along the way where there are these juncture points where it looks like it's all over for our heroes, but they have sacrificed enough to be rewarded by divine intervention or catastrophe, and he does then intercede to nudge it along the way towards that greater plan. So it's interesting because the concept of free will is very, very important to Catholics in particular, because you have these things where people are allowed to make these choices of whether they do right or wrong, right? And it's not preordained from God that you will be a bad person because everyone is created good. So it is interesting to me with that relationship, and it is like, what is the plan of Illuvatar? How detailed is this plan? No one knows it apart from Manway has hints of it, but other than that, no one really knows. No one can fathom it, because he is just something completely different to everyone else that has been created. So it's interesting to me to kind of try to see where that lies in terms of the storytelling. Like, was it always meant to be this way? Are there juncture points where it could be a little bit different, with the same outcome at the very end, of which is basically either unmade and then remade as perfect again, so it's, I find that very interesting, and I do kind of think, because, like, a lot of the characters, a lot of our heroes that do find themselves in these impossible situations where there is this divine intervention, they've suffered for it, which is also a very, very key part of the Christian faith, of reward from suffering. But they're not looking for a reward, if you know what I mean. It's not like they're not doing it because they think, I'm going to be rewarded for this. They're doing it because it's like, this is the right thing to do, or I'm the only person that can do this, and then they get the reward. So it's which is so tied into Catholic religion that it's, you could sometimes, when you talk about one, it's like you could be talking about Eve, you could be talking about the plot of Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, or you could be talking about the Catholic faith. So they're so entwined.
Gotcha. So you're saying, like, so a big part of it is the characters have free will, right? And it's at the same time, it's kind of inside. You see, like, Illuvatar's entire plan in the story, and then, it's not like all the characters are robots,
right?
Kind
Exactly.
of things.
Yeah.
So they have their own free will to choose, also, and, like, so if they choose to do the right thing, that can become a reward to that character, right? So that's kind of like the idea.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, and then if you look at the Silmarillion, you can see instances, and I think of someone like Turin Turambar, who made the wrong choices at these particular moments, and obviously his life started off as a tragedy and becomes an even greater tragedy, and a great evil, isn't it? I think, it's the things that are inflicted upon him and the stuff that he inflicts upon others are without a doubt evil, in Tolkien's mind as well. Obviously, he's just incest, and there is, all sorts of horrible things like that go on, and he's repeatedly given a choice of, is he going to rise above this curse? And it's interesting with the whole concept of that curse of Morgoth, is how much of that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and how much is that because he keeps on making the wrong choices, right? And that's really, really interesting as well, to kind of look at that, because could he have chose a different way? Was some of it just a curse? Was some of it his own choice? Was it Ilúvatar's plan for him to suffer in this way? And if so, why was that Illuvatar's plan to make him suffer in such a way? Like, what had he done to deserve that? Is Morgoth's power of this curse greater than Ilúvatar's will? So you have to kind of think in that regard that the free will aspect is quite strong, because he does make the wrong choice over and over and over again. And each wrong choice he gets delivered greater evil upon himself or others. So there is instances of free will within all that, and there's a lot of it in Lord of the Rings as well. There's a lot of it where people are given the choice to do something and they choose one way or the other. I think of Grimmer Wormtongue is given three choices to walk away from Saruman, and each time he doesn't, he decides to stay with him. So the first time is when he's turfed out of Edoras, and they're given the option to stay and renounce him, and he doesn't. He flees. He is given a choice when at Orthanc to leave with them, and he decides not to. And then on the road again, when they meet him on the road, they give him another chance, and he decides not to. So he is continuously given this choice to renounce him, but he doesn't. And then in the end, he commits murder and is murdered himself. So that is an instance of free will, I think, there within this larger scheme of Ilúvatar's. I don't think Grimmer Wormtongue's role beyond where we meet him in the story was going to change anything all too greatly, but his own personal role of how long he spends in the halls of madness and what happens to men after they move on from there, that would change greatly depending on those choices that he makes. And that's where the instance of free will comes into it versus the scheme of the plan, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Because like the thing is that, for instance, like in Lord of the Rings, I think it's a little bit harder to say sometimes than like the Silmarillion, because like the only real clear, like, it's like I could think of, like, I mean, I think we've already mentioned it too, like, Bilbo finding the ring, Frodo getting the ring, and then like Gollum, like, falling into Mount Doom and with the ring, or like the two kind of clear instances of saying, oh yeah, this is. I think like people for the most part can just say that those are
they're big ones. They're the big picture ones, yeah.
right.
Sure.
Then
yeah,
and like everything, and it's like a lot of other things you could say, like, oh yeah, I mean, because of like Tolkien's faith and and like theology and all, you might be able to say like other things or kind of work that way. I mean, the Eagles just seem to arrive at the right time and places, and and some other things as well like that.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, the Eagles are the heralds of Manwë, aren't they? And Manwë is the one who is closest to Ilúvatar's fort than any other of the Arnor. So that's also like is that Ilúvatar actually? But I always kind of think about Sam when he has the ring in Cirith Ungol, and he's outside of Shelob's tunnel, and he's just bumbling around the place, isn't he, for a good long time, just trying to, and everything seems to go right for him. He's able to stay hidden. He's able to find the right orcs to listen to find the way that he's going, and everything. And this whole like kind of civil war happens before he even gets there. And it's all kind of like little moments like that. But there's another one that I always I love it. It's an amazing piece of writing, and it's something that always sticks with me. Is there's a bit where Sam and Frodo are crossing the Gorgoroth, and they've discarded all of their armor and everything like that, and they're in a pit, and they're just both of them are so tired. And there's a bit where they're just looking up at the sky, and it's just a smog-filled sky. And then at just one point, the cloud just appear, and then they see the star of Earendil above them. and both of them have like this rekindled hope for a little while. And I always think about that, and it's like, is that Illuvatar just saying to them, just keep going? I'm watching. There's still hope. There's still this. Is it a coincidence? I like to think that it is Illuvatar just nudging things a little bit and just saying, like, you're on the right path, and you're gonna get your suffering is gonna be rewarded. But you can look into that in different ways. So I think there's like, this thing where, the saying of God works in mysterious ways. I think that kind of applies to Ilúvatar quite a lot, because I mean, these are big questions, aren't they? These are things that people talk about in theology, of free will versus predestination, of how God can allow such suffering, and so on. And it's there in Tolkien's work. It invites you to speculate about it, and to dig into it, and to discuss it, and draw conclusions, because it's so rich, and it's so thematically rich in a way that, like I mentioned before, Narnia isn't in that way. I'm not to say that like Narnia isn't good, but it doesn't have that richness, that because it's not as baked into the text as it is in Tolkien.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, because even though it is kind of clear about, Aslan's supposed to be Christ and a lot of those other parallels, like one to one almost. Yeah, it's like it's almost like the subtle themes almost make like the Lord of the Rings story deeper. You have to dig for them a little bit more, and and even like you got to think like, okay, how much? It'd be interesting to see like to talk to Tolkien and be like, so how much of this
Right.
of Ilúvatar was actually like supposed to be like impacting this, at these points?
Yeah.
Because he says that he went back and he like with his revisions, right? He made it more intentionally Christian
Yes. Yeah. He
from that
did. Yeah.
one letter. So like that's really interesting.
And there's a lot of that as well, where as he got older, he began all of his work when he was revising stuff, particularly for the Silmarillion. It was becoming more and more Christian as he was getting older, and I think it's fair to say that Tolkien was pretty Christian when he first started writing, and so I don't know, he must have been like uber Christian by the end of times, and I think he was troubled by a few aspects of what he had created. Um, Particularly around free will. So there's the story of the origin of the orcs, which he was working on until very close to when he died. The two big things that he was working on that he constantly was revising was the origin of the orcs and the character of Galadriel. And Galadriel was becoming more and more like this Mary figure with each revision, with each pass, which is why there's so much inconsistency with the character outside of the Lord of the Rings. But with the orcs, um, he was very, very worried about the fact that evil can't create, um, so they can only corrupt, which is why he first said that they were, in his notes, that they were corrupted elves of some kind, right? But then he was like, well, our heroes are murdering corrupted elves. That's not nice of our heroes to do. So then he was like, well, what are they? Because they can't be completely created, because evil can't create. So were they kind of like automatons that had spirits trapped in them of some kind, and which he wasn't sure about either. And he wrestled with this for until the end of his life, in terms of how to address it in his world. Whereas many people would just say, yeah, they're corrupted elves and they are now evil. Let's just, wipe them out. they're the bad guys. That wasn't enough for Tolkien, because um, it isn't morally right, because they weren't chosen to be corrupted, right? They were forcefully corrupted. And we do see instances of free will with the orcs as well. There's that bit again with Sam and Frodo, where they overhear. Sorry, when it's Sam, isn't it? He overhears two orcs talking, and they're saying that should we just sneak off and just go and have it our own way. They're still quite evil. They're on about going ransacking some places and what have you, but they're kind of talking about don't really want to be here. Actually, want to kind of go off on our own and do our own thing, like the old days before which you led to presume it's before Sauron came back again, where they had a bit of more free reign. So there's lots of these interesting little wrinkles within that. And like you say, if you could talk to Tolkien and ask him some questions, a week wouldn't be enough to ask him all this stuff and go over it, and I would, if he was still alive today, right? If he was 23 years old or whatever age he would be, I'd still think he would still be revising a lot of the stuff because they are big questions. A lot of the stuff that he was dealing with. He was dealing with concepts of creation. He was dealing with concepts of good versus evil. He was dealing with corruption. He was dealing with religion in a very, very personal and intrinsic way that was so key to the way that his world worked. And I think a person's relationship with their religion changes throughout their life, depending on their experiences and their age. So I think it would have been, you'd ask him the same, if you could ask him the same questions at different points of his life, I think you might get slightly different answers.
Right. So what would you say to someone who would say that, like, well, there really isn't that much divine intervention in Lord of the Rings because Tolkien wasn't doing a one-to-one allegory or like comparison to like the Christian God, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely fine. Right? I think we go back to that subtlety. I think as you mentioned with Narnia, it's pretty hard to escape that Aslan is meant to be Jesus, and these certain roles are supposed to be filled by certain people from the Bible and from the religion. I think with Tolkien, because there is more subtlety to it, even though to me it's more intrinsic. You could pick up the Lord of the Rings and not have heard of anything to do with Catholic religion and read it and just take it as it is, right? I think you don't need to. But similarly as well, like you could read it with no knowledge of World War One, or know that Tolkien was involved in World War One, and still you'd still get that imagery and you'd still get that horror in aspects. And I think about the Dead Marches scenes and places like that. That still is telegraphed, but you wouldn't have to have any prior knowledge of it to kind of understand that. And I think that's the same with the religion aspects in it as well. I think it invites people to draw their own conclusions, and it invites people to look into it deeply, and people that have prior knowledge or have studied his work and studied his letters and all that, you're probably a little bit more kind of able to kind of see these influences and how it's been constructed. But if you are a person that doesn't know any of that or don't like to see any kind of echoes of religion in the work, it's quite easy, I think, to do that as well at the same time, because the aspects of gods, because there is multiple gods. I suppose they're angels, really, if you get really, really technical, and the Illuvatar in the Lord of the Rings are so far removed from what is going on in terms of like the action, in terms of like physically being there. I often wonder, what did the Gondorians think about Ilúvatar and the gods? Did they know about them? Did they believe in them? Were they stories from myth and legend? Obviously, like the elves would know about them, the ones that were still around, but the common men that were removed from Númenóreans and like the Rohirrim and the hobbits, what was their relationship with them? Did they have any relationship with them? Did they worship them? Which I think is quite an interesting thing. It's the gods that don't require worship, which is very unusual um, for any type of god in fiction or in real life, particularly coming from a Catholic. So, but then again, I think it's Tolkien's way of doing it is that people are worshipping Illuvatar by trying to do good and doing the right thing, and by which is a very kind of medieval story, old English story of how characters were more like they revealed their personalities through their actions. Their valor was revealed through action instead of words. Um, and the same can be said of a lot of the characters in Lord of the Rings. That the characters themselves don't particularly change very much. They don't have many ways of like the Aragorn in the books is the same Aragorn at the end. He's always ready to be king. He wants to be king. He wants to do his part. But his valor and his virtue and his goodness is shown through his actions, which I think is a way of honouring Ilúvatar. Same with Frodo. Same with Sam. So I always find that interesting because I think you can look at it and go, "This is not a religious work at all." Right? It's only these elves and Gandalf occasionally that talks about this concept of gods and whatnot. But it's when you go into the wider works like the Silmarillion, History of Middle Earth, Unfinished Tales, it becomes inescapable. I think to me where the influences were, and Tolkien particularly viewed those as his greater works, particularly the Silmarillion. That was his. That was his that was his largest work, wasn't it? The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings was a part of it. Um, but if you just read the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings in isolation, I think and that's your conclusion to it. I think that's completely valid, and that's the beauty of his work. You can enjoy the aspects of it you enjoy the most, and the aspects of it that there's so much of it. If there's some part of it that you don't enjoy as much, you're quickly onto something else that you do.
Yes, it's interesting. I'm a Protestant, and I still think that like a lot of what kind of Tolkien's, I guess you say, just worldview. I do agree with. But it's also interesting to try to get like a really good perspective as like his faith as a Catholic, or even from other Catholics, to you figure out things like, oh, like Christmas, and it was like the day the fellowship set out, and the
Right.
other
Yeah.
like day on the calendar is like when they destroyed the ring, I think.
Yeah. That's Easter. Easter. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So but yeah, it's really cool to be able to like dig in and see all those different themes of it, and yeah.
Yeah, and I think you've got to kind of respect it as well because it's like for me as someone who's like moved away from being religious, I suppose I wouldn't say that I'm an atheist or anything. I'm probably agnostic, where like I kind of admire people's faith and I wish that I kind of had that same faith, and I'm also like I would be delighted if I was wrong, right? It'd be great if there is heaven and all this kind of stuff, and it would be wonderful. But I think you um, need to respect that is Tolkien's worldview, and you don't have to agree with it, but you have to respect it in terms of it is a Christian work. Um, and I think he said that himself. It's a Christian work, and it is. There's so many, but you're able to put that to one side if you want to, and not engage with it. But when you do look under the hood, I suppose it becomes um, inescapable. Like you just said with the dates where everything happens, like they leave Rivendell on Christmas Day, the ring is destroyed um, on the original, what they think is the original date of Easter. There's other things as well where things happen on like Shrove Tuesday and other things like that. Um, and I think it's from when Frodo sets out to. There's something about 9 months in there as well. I can't remember what the thing is, but there's something very particular about 9 months as well. Like obviously it being conception and what have you is involved. So there's all these kind of things that are all over it, you know. And then you always go back to that kind of thing that only God can create and only one God can create as well, which is intrinsic to Christian faith, and that we as humans um, strive to create because it's that bit of creativity is in us, but all we can do is express what has already been made, that is already part of the plan, and there's a part of God in all of us, right? And that is so key to Tolkien's belief of how his world works. Um, and you have to respect that, right? He was completely committed to this way of thinking, and obviously there's other influences there as well. There's huge influence from um, tales from, like, Norse mythology and Icelandic, like Finnish mythology. Like there's huge influence from all that kind of stuff. Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon um, legends and mythologies. I mean, even the way it's written, there are no. Most of the words that are used, if you can use a French variant or an Anglo-Saxon variant, the Anglo-Saxon variant is used instead of the French ones. He commits completely to what he wants to commit to, and that's the same with the religion aspect in it. He that was just how he viewed the world, and that was what was important to him. And that is why the work is the way that it is. And on whatever level you enjoy it, that is part of it, I think.
Yeah, so another thing I thought we should touch on with divine intervention is coincidence and chance circumstances that come up. So I think like the biggest one that I think a lot of people see is when Bilbo found the ring, right? He kind of fell upon it, and in a sense, it was kind of a chance encounter. So I guess, and also like we have the quote with Gandalf and Frodo talking about how Bilbo was meant to find the ring. So
Yeah.
we can see that there are some instances like that. So I guess maybe David, like, are there other instances that are kind of chance encounters or coincidences, I guess, in the Lord of the
Yeah,
Rings?
it's an interesting one because basically, in terms of Tolkien's Christianity, there is no such thing as coincidence. It's all divine providence, um, which would infer through Illuvatar as well. So there's a couple of times where people do actually discuss it, kind of head on. Gandalf talks about it, Tom Bombadil talks about it, and Elrond talks about it. That how chance meetings and coincidences are generally something else at work, which is Ilúvatar's divine providence, which would also match up then with Christianity. There is no coincidence. It's things that are meant to happen and part of a plan. So that's quite entwined with that. Another way of kind of looking at it, and I can't quite remember exactly where I read this or I heard it, maybe on a podcast or something. I think it might be in one of the History of Middle Earth books, and or it might be one of Tolkien's letters. And he talks about how free will and coincidence and divine providence and eucatastrophe and so on and so forth. And he puts it into writing terms, which is really interesting because it's kind of the way that I would write. So when you are a writer, you get some people that are called plotters, which kind of plot out the entire thing and they know everything that's going to kind of happen. And you get some people that are called pantsers, which is they just make it up as they go along. And most writers generally would be pantsers or like discovery writers. But there's like kind of a middle way. which is kind of a bit what I am, and I think it's kind of what Tolkien was as well to an extent. He was quite a discovery writer in a lot of ways, but it's you have the framework of the plan, right? You know basically where everything is going to go. You know where it's leading to, but then the characters will act independently within the story sometimes. Like you may just come up to a point where you thought you knew where the story was going to go, and the characters will speak to you, right, and say, "No, this isn't the way. I wouldn't react this way. I would do this." And they would act a different way, but it would still end up being the same end point, right? But you just take a different way of getting there. And I think that's a really, really interesting way of looking at how the concept of free will works within this framework of Illuvatar's plan of that it's going to be, he knows where it's going, but not quite where it's going there, and then that kind of ties in with those kind of people like earning these kinds of new catastrophe and through their actions and everything like that. So that's quite an interesting way of looking at it, where it's kind of looking at that also as Tolkien looking at it as a sub-creator within God's creation, which he was in his point of view. Obviously, Middle Earth is set in our world as part of the framework of it, and in the very, very distant past, and it all needs to make sense within our world in a way. So to kind of marry that with that, as Tolkien has seen himself as a sub-creator, he was always meant to create Lord of the Rings within God's plan, but maybe the ways that he went to do it were of his own free will, like sort of how he approached it, when it happened, the small details of how it did, but he was always meant to write it. It's as we talked about in the podcast, it's these big questions of theology and that add so much richness to this world, because in my opinion, you can't separate the theology, Tolkien's theology, his Christian theology, from the creation of Lord of the Rings and the way that the world works. It's all entwined. So yeah, so for me, from that point of view, there is no coincidence. It's all part of the plan, or it's been earned that way to kind of get to that end point that Ilúvatar has in mind.
So as you were saying with the story writing in general, like sometimes authors will write the story a certain way, but then they'll go back and they'll change it, but they'll still get to the same end. The characters just might be doing different things.
Yeah, right. I mean, sometimes authors will write that have no ending in mind anyway, and it's basically it's the sum of what has happened before that kind of chooses it. But a lot of time is like, we will kind of have a beginning, middle, and an end in mind. I mean, the way I kind of describe it is, I kind of describe it as garden path writing. It's like I'm stood at the back door of my garden and I'm looking across my garden and I can see the exit to my garden, and I know that there's a big tree, and I know there's a pond, and I know that there's a slide, and I know that I have to go past these things to get to the gate. But then what happens on the way there and the way that I approach it, I'll decide when I get there, or the characters will decide for me, but I know that I'm heading towards the gate. And that is kind of that thing of predestination versus free will. I'm destined to go to the gate, but the way that I get there is, is my choice. It's my free will. But the big decisions that are in in life, they're kind of predetermined, right? That's part of the big plan. It's how you get there. So if you take that into Lord of the Rings, the ring was always meant to be destroyed at some point, right? How that ring was destroyed, there could be different ways that would happen, but the people involved in it would have to earn that kind of new catastrophe, because they may fail, or like fail completely. They might succumb to the ring, but at some point it would still be destroyed because that is part of Illuvatar's plan. And as part of his plan, it has to get to this point where the world is unmade and then remade as it was without Morgoth's intervention, which was always part of the plan, right? Because as Ilúvatar said, there is no part of you that is not a part of me. So yeah, it's these are these big questions, these big thoughts to think about, and it's something that people will never agree on. You have people that are not religious that will say they have complete free will, right? And there is no such thing as free destiny and divine intervention and divine providence, and it's all about coincidences and mishaps and all that kind of stuff. You get people that are at completely the other side. It's all part of a plan, right? And then you might have people that are somewhere in the middle, and that is the same relationship that people can have with Lord of the Rings as well. Like I said earlier, if people want to read it in a certain way and go, well, actually, these characters are wrong, even though they've stated it. You can sometimes say that characters are wrong. There's no reason to say that characters aren't wrong. They're just talking from their own knowledge, unless you hear it from the absolute source, which would be in this case Ilúvatar. It's just people's point of view, really. They can be more informed than other people. Like, you'd probably think that Tom Bombadil would be quite an authority on it, seeing as he is the oldest, and you'd think Gandalf next would be quite a good authority because he's been to Valinor and he's met Ilúvatar. He's part of Ilúvatar and he knows that. So you'd imagine they're good authorities, but you can still disagree with them and say, well, yeah, actually, that's just your point of view, right? And Gollum falling into the cracks of doom was a coincidence, and Frodo failed and coincidence saved the day. But I don't think that was the spirit of what Tolkien was going for. Not only in terms of his beliefs, but also in part of the story, because that's quite a. I mean, the end of Lord of the Rings is a bittersweet ending anyway, which I think is only informed by Tolkien's experiences in World War One of people coming back from war changed and altered, and it is bittersweet, but to have them win because of sheer coincidence would be completely against the spirit of what Tolkien was doing, which was good people trying their best to make a difference, right, and earning that eucatastrophe, as it's called, that divine providence, that divine intervention, and to kind of mark it down as a coincidence would just completely dismiss all of that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like it's like in the larger picture of things, it can't just be a coincidence because then everything else kind of, I guess, falls apart in a sense.
Right,
But
and the sacrifice then, the sacrifice of characters, and I don't mean them dying, like, because relatively few characters, like named major characters in the Lord of the Rings, die. Like, it's not like the Silmarillion, which is an absolute bloodbath from section to section. But in Lord of the Rings, like, of the main characters, it's Theoden, Denethor, and Boromir, I think, and that is pretty much it. Saruman as well, I guess. But although Saruman is tied to the world, so he's kind of just like a formless evil drifting around. So it's relatively few people meet the ultimate sacrifice. But they're all sacrificing something. They're sacrificing that leaving home. They're sacrificing their freedom. They're sacrificing their fortitude, and many other things. And to kind of mark it all down as coincidence, what kind of dismisses that, and I don't think that is Tolkien's intention. Not to kind of put intention into an author's hands that may not be theirs, but knowing of Tolkien and researching and we have such a wealth of material to kind of know his mind and to know his beliefs and everything. I don't think that would have been his intention. I think it was to be that, this is all part of a plan within free will, within part of divine providence and the larger plan.
Right. So like maybe like one last thing. Um so I read this book. It's called I think The Christian World of the Hobbit.
Yeah.
And one thing I can't remember the guy's name who wrote the book. But I've gone through it, and one thing he was talking about was the amount of times that luck came up in The Hobbit. And he might have even mentioned the Lord of the Rings as well on that. He talked about like quite a few different things, but with like divine intervention, he was even talking about how the dwarves and Bilbo coming to the door on Durin's Day was kind of like this kind of coincidence, because I guess they didn't really know exactly what they were going, like when to like I guess be there and such. But I thought it was interesting. I never like heard that before.
Yeah.
But
I was going to say it's an interesting. That's by Devin Brown, isn't it? I think that book.
yes,
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one because it's a very. I've read through that before, and it's a very kind of look at. It does kind of talk about that kind of side of luck versus kind of like fundamental providence and other things like that. And I think it's with that as well. I think it's you can look into it of your own relationship with it, but I think it's one of those things that it's either no coincidence or it's all coincidence. I think I think it is very much like I'm tend not to be a very binary person like that. I'm not a very black and white person, but I think Tolkien was to a huge extent, and I think with that kind of thing of them, like the dwarves arriving on Durin's Day and or just before Durin's Day, and just kind of like being there when it all happened and everything like that is part of the plan, right? I think the thing is as well, what we have to also bear in mind with the Hobbit, it was that it wasn't meant to be a part of Middle Earth originally. Like, it was a break from the Silmarillion stuff that he was working on. It was for his children, and then it was just like he did that thing where it's like, I'm just going to throw in a reference to Gondel in here and just throw in a and obviously, like, when he started working on the Lord of the Rings, he went back and revised parts of the Hobbit to kind of make it particularly the bits with riddles in the dark and everything. And I would imagine that if he had the time and was allowed to, he'd probably revise quite a bit more of it to kind of fit in a little bit more. That does. So I think there's that thing you have to kind of bear in mind with it as well, that it is very much like. I mean, I kind of look at it as, and this is the way that Tolkien kind of framed it, wasn't it? When he for the revision of the Hobbit, where he said that Bilbo was lying and Gandalf ended up getting the full story out of him. You've really got to take Bilbo as telling a few tall tales in that book. So it does come down to like unreliable narrator quite a bit within the world, which suits the character of Bilbo. He's a showman, isn't he? He's or a show hobbit. He likes a bit of a ripping yarn of a story, doesn't he? And we don't know what exactly is the truth of the Hobbit in world. From lots of different reasons, like talking animals and stuff like that. Is it just you can say that in world that it's like it's Bilbo exaggerating, but obviously as its thing, it's because it was written for his children. So you have to kind of bear that in mind with the Hobbit, I think. And I think that the themes of Christianity and creation are more present in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. Way more in the Silmarillion. I think I think it's that the Silmarillion is like, it's the elves' history of creation, isn't it? So it's very, very much deals with creation and the fire of life and the fire of creation, and only good can create, and only everything started as good. It deals with these very, very big themes like that, which The Hobbit kind of avoids for the most part.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense that those stories are more in depth than The Hobbit is, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I always kind of like to how it's framed in the world, because obviously The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are framed as the Red Book of Westmarch, aren't they? And that they were written by Bilbo, then Frodo, and then bits by Merry Pippin and Sam. Um, and then Tolkien found it at some point and translated it from Westron. That's the kind of, so you have to kind of think of it as like, those books are written by the hobbits and look at it through that lens. But the Silmarillion is very much written as the elvish history of Arda. So it kind of obviously deals with because they were able to speak to the people that were there at creation. They were able to interact with Manwë and Mandos and um, all these kind of Fingal married Melian and all this kind of stuff. They were interacting with them. So they would kind of have, but also it's kind of like, is it true? Are they mistaken about some things? Is some of it corrupted? Is some of that history corrupted by Morgoth? Because obviously they spent a lot of time with when he was Melkor, when he was captured in Valinor for thousands of years, right? Um, so you have to, even with that, you have to kind of look at unreliable narrators with it. But again, it's kind of like it deals more with those kinds of themes because it involves the people that were there at the beginning or very close to the beginning. So you kind of look at it through that frame. It's the sort of stuff that hobbits really wouldn't be all that interested in, right? Because they're mostly interested in a peaceful life, and we don't even know what gods the hobbits or gods the hobbits worship. We don't even know if they worship anything like that. Um, really, we know a lot about the hobbits, but we also know very little about them in terms of their belief systems and what have you. We know that they're mannish, so we know that they would they have this gift of Illuvatar that the elves don't even know what it is, but the hobbits don't really seem to care about it. So it doesn't really get touched on all that much. It's only when other characters come into it and they talk about, like Gandalf mentions it, Elrond mentions it, Tom Bombadil mentions this thing of free will versus um, coincidence versus a plan. But it's way more dealt with head on in the Silmarillion, as it should be.
So, what would you say are like some good places for people to like books or whatever to learn more about like Tolkien's faith and worldview and how that impacted his writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think going straight to the source is always the best with this. Like Tolkien's letters in particular, the new version that's just been revised because they found newer letters, or they were able to release newer letters. Because I believe that there is still like a wealth of documents that haven't been released yet, and they will be at some point. I think that's a really, really good one. The History of Middle Earth volumes are really good because you can see the development of ideas over time. And you can see a lot of kind of like notes from Christopher Tolkien as well in terms of like how it develops and insight into their thinking. One that I think is really, really good is The Nature of Middle Earth, because it really kind of delves into like the real stuff that is very, very niche for like most people, and it talks about like elven gestation periods and like all sorts of stuff like this. But it's fascinating as well because it kind of really delves into like how Middle Earth works in terms of like this kind of stuff. And there's another one that I really enjoyed, which was, let me just get the name of it because I don't want to mistake the name of it. So it's called Tolkien's Faith for Spiritual Biology. Sorry, biography, not biology. That would be very, very different. Um, and it's by Ollie Ordway. It only came out a few years ago, so it's and it's a really, really good one. And I think kind of um, looking at that and then looking at kind of like Tolkien's letters and the nature of Middle Earth are really good free books to kind of really kind of get a handle on where he was coming from with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I am actually working right now to have Holly on the podcast.
Oh,
So
excellent,
yeah,
excellent.
so hopefully that works out. But
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Her book is brilliant. It's really, 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 really in depth and really, really, really thoughtful. And I think and when I say it's really in depth, it's nearly 600 pages long. Like it's very, very much in depth. But I
yeah.
think it's really, really good.
hmm Yeah, and imagine because she's also a Catholic that it kind of I don't know, like she may understand some things better, but from his faith, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think uh, I think it's that kind of thing where I think if you've got an open mind, it doesn't matter too much. I think you can look at it on the and give it on face value and go, well, this is what Tolkien believed in, right? And then just instead of passing judgment on that, just kind of looking at, well, this is what he believed in, and was important to him, and absolutely important to him. In all manner of ways, right? It was completely all encompassing, his Christianity. So I feel like I said before, you have to respect that. I think, and if you come with that and you're looking at it in good faith, then I think and you're engaging with it in good faith, then I think anyone's kind of worldview, you can look at it in different ways. I think it's when people kind of engage with something in bad faith where I think it becomes a little bit dangerous. It would be very easy for me as someone, as we talked about, someone who's like basically agnostic to be like dismissive of a lot of this stuff that is in his work and everything. But it's that wouldn't be fair, and I wouldn't be very being truthful of what I see in it, you know. So I think and I can still find comfort and inspiration in the faith that is in Tolkien's work. But I think it works on a lot of different levels. So I think I think it's undeniable that there is the religious aspect, but I think the reason for me that Tolkien's work, particularly Lord of the Rings, stands the test of time, it's because people have faith in goodness and they have faith in each other, and I think that transcends a lot of the other messages in the books. And I think that is something that no matter what your religious belief, we all want to have faith in our brothers and sisters. And the world is better if we do, and if people are acting in good faith and working towards good. And I think that's why Lord of the Rings is just the number one, right? And always probably will be, because there's nothing else that really um, commits to those themes as much as anything else. And if that is because of um, Tolkien's religious views, then brilliant. And if it's not, it's just what he believed in, then that's still brilliant, right? However it comes to that, it's great.
Yeah. And that's true. It definitely is something that I guess everybody can find, in the least something positive and, you know, like even just like kind of the good versus evil, people like the good guys winning, I mean,
Right.
that sort
Yeah.
of thing. So,
Yeah. It's
um,
it's it's hope, isn't it? It's like at the end of the day, it's hope. People want hope in their lives, and um, in Lord of the Rings, in particular, it's a bunch of people striving against hope, and they don't let that hope die. Even in the darkest night in the worst places, they still have that hope, and they come through. Hope sees them through, and that is a really, really comforting thing for everyone from any walk of life, no matter what their belief is to hold on to hope. And I think that is at the core of that is what Lord of the Rings is about. And it's a beautiful message, right? And it's something that everyone can experience and everyone can identify with. And like I said, if that comes from his religion, then it's a beautiful message, And if it doesn't come from his religion, it's still a beautiful message. I'm inclined to think it comes from his religion because I think that was important to him. And I don't have to agree with that aspect of it, of terms of that's where I get my hope from. But we both like the divine plan. We both come to the same place at the same end. And that is both agreeing that hope is a really important thing and a beautiful thing to have.
Yeah. No, yeah, I appreciate that. Appreciate that sentiment. Yeah. So, yeah, thanks, David. Yeah,
Thanks very much.
Yeah, this has been good. So, we will add this into the podcast because we had realized that we didn't talk about this before. So, yeah. So, thanks everybody.
Bonus material.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, thanks, David, for coming on and talking about divine intervention in Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And yeah, I had a great time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll catch you for our next episode next week.